Thanks as always to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. And don't forget, you can also find Kyndryl Institute, where they have a wealth of brilliant knowledge and information at kyndryl.com/institute. Welcome back, and thank you for the brilliant feedback on this book, Productive Failure. I'm delighted to have back with us the author of Productive Failure, Manu Kapur. You're very welcome back.
Thank you. Lovely to be back.
And I have a copy up for grabs. Don't forget, just sign up to our Substack and you can be in the hat to win a copy. And we've already given away copy 1 of the book. It's a brilliant read. I want to get stuck in because we have very little time with our guest today. We want to touch on the 4 A's, which is the science behind productive failure. But before we did that, I wanted to share the idea of the basic knowledge fallacy. I thought this was really important for many of us who need to unlearn and relearn in today's volatile business economy.
Thanks, Aidan. So the basic knowledge fallacy is actually something so intuitive, something so counterintuitive, rather. So what we found in our, so I'll start with what we found in our experiments and then explain what the basic knowledge fallacy is all about. So basically, when we compared productive failure to direct instruction, we looked at, okay, how did students in our case, how well did they achieve basic foundational knowledge? But we also studied how well they understood the concepts that they're trying to understand, that we were targeting. And then we also measured how flexible were they in adapting and transferring those concepts to new situations. So we call that transfer. And we found that for both productive failure and direct instruction, both groups of students are equally good and highly effective in developing basic knowledge fluency and the concept that was being taught. But where the differences arose were in the depth of the understanding of the why, the way it is formulated the way it is, right? And like I said, your ability to transfer that, solve novel problems to solve a more advanced problem. So, and people think, and teachers and parents, and I used to think like that as well, that, when it comes to knowledge, maybe it doesn't matter how you acquire basic knowledge. That just needs to be given. The higher level problem solving and understanding and transfer can be built on top of. Once you have the basics, you can build the more complex, more advanced reasoning on top. But what we started finding in our experiments was, here you have 2 groups of students who are equally good at basic knowledge, but they understand that very knowledge in very different ways, and their ability to apply that knowledge to novel contexts is also very different. So what this is telling us, that you can't just simply give the basic knowledge. How you learn that basic knowledge actually influences how well you understand it and how well you transfer it. So it may appear that the learning path does not matter if you just look at the basic knowledge fluency, but if you start probing other variables like understanding and transfer, you find out, actually the trick was in how you learned the basics in the first place. And I think that's the thing that most people find really counterintuitive.
And it explains why so many of us will get through our exams for whatever our exam is when you're 18, 17, 18 across your different countries, and then forget it a week later, and definitely a year later. You won't retain any of that knowledge, but it's almost like you've inhaled it long enough to get through that period of time, but it hasn't stuck at all.
Yeah. And sticking is the minimum criteria, right? You have to understand it. Even if it gets stuck, you still don't understanding deeply enough. I think that's the point, that even when it gets stuck, it's not depth. There's no depth to it.
I think, as you were training to be a professional football player and I went through the same experience, I think one of the biggest things for me was, if you're going to do this, do it right. And if you're going to go to the training session, if you're going to go to the gym, you may as well do it right, because then you have no regrets about it. And when I look back at the amount of time we spend learning, unwillingly for so many people, but you're there anyway, And to not do it right is just, it feels like torture to me, to know that there could have been a better way where this knowledge could have stuck. You could have built on that knowledge over time. And let's just share before we get into awareness, the contrast between direct instruction and discovery learning, and also the empathy. I mean, it's so difficult for, say, a teacher who wants to bring in discovery learning, but they have a curriculum to stick to. And there's that paradox, or that fight in themselves even. Maybe they know it's wrong or it's not working as well, but it's very hard to change the whole curricula.
Yeah, so discovery learning is this idea that, learners should be able to figure things out by themselves. Give them enough time and resources. They should come up with their own solutions. They should come up with their own ideas and lead to the correct canonical conceptions as well. And that never happened. It's very hard for learners, and the experimental data is very clear that this pure discovery, we call this pure discovery, where there's no facilitation, there is no support, just the learner is alone with the problem and they have a go at it. So when studies have compared pure problem solving, a pure discovery with direct instruction, which is the idea that, if you don't know something, let me tell you exactly what it is. Let me show you examples, explain it to you. And once you've learned it, then you get a chance to solve problems using that thing that you've learned. So you can see how these two are diametrically opposite. Here you have just pure problem solving, no facilitation, no expert. Go figure it out. And this is where very expert led. Let me tell you exactly what it is, and then you go solve. And when you compare these two, the results are very clearly in favor of direct instruction. And so against this body of literature, I started to think about productive failure, which is basically, in a way, combines the best of both the worlds. It doesn't do pure discovery. We do design problem-solving activities that we don't just say, go figure out, but we design them in ways that students feel they're intuitive, that they can generate multiple solutions and representations, yet they don't get to the correct answer. So I call it very constrained, failure-based discovery, right? In a safe space, as I said, with the right set of expectations. And then the teacher comes in with the instruction to build on that, on what they did in the first phase, in the generation phase. And that's how the failure becomes productive. So you take a debate, which is on the extremes, and you say, well, basically take the best of discovery, curate it, constrain it in a way that's relevant, what you're going to learn. And if you can do that, then you bring the instruction to tie in with what the knowledge of the student does. And when you take these two together and you align them well, that's what makes it even more powerful than either of those two. And that's exactly what the failure does.
Let's get into some of the science, because in part 2, you dive deep into the science. And for those of you who that'll put you off, he does a great job of breaking it down for the non-scientific reader. But to tee it up, you say in the book, failure made students or learners aware of who they were and what they really wanted. It helped them to focus. Failure created the affect, the motivation to push harder toward that focus. And with the right help at the right time, whether from friends, family, coaches, or mentors, they managed to put it all together, assemble it, and made their failure productive. That's a tee up for the 4 A's. And we're going to start today with activation, but there's other ones: activation, awareness, of affect, and assembly. The 4 A's at the heart of productive failure. Let's get stuck into activation.
Right. So activation is the idea that we process new information by trying to connect it with what we already know. It doesn't matter whether that what we know is something that we formally learned or we've experienced in life, or that we have certain intuitions about the world. The mind basically tries to ease our processing load, trying to connect with what we already know. And, so the idea of productive failure is that you activate relevant knowledge when you get people to try different things, even if they don't work out to be correct solutions. They've tried things that are relevant to what they're going to learn later. So the knowledge has been activated in relevant ways. And to the extent that you can do that, you prepare the learner to process new information better and to also integrate that new information better, because you have more things to connect, more relevant knowledge to connect. Okay. So that's why activation is key. And failure does a really good job at deliberately activating well. As a consequence of activation, what happens is that there's a greater awareness of a gap in your knowledge. So you've tried a number of things. Yes, in the process, you've activated your knowledge, but they haven't worked fully or optimally. So you get a sense, you get an awareness that, okay, here's what I can do, which is in many ways surprising to people because people start out thinking, there's nothing I can do with this. So they're themselves surprised that, oh, there's so much I can do. But there's then the awareness that, oh, what I can do, and what I need to do, there's a bit of a gap. And there's an awareness that, oh, I tried something, it didn't work. There's a gap between what I have and what I know and what I need to know. And that awareness itself is a really powerful mechanism because activation and awareness together sets up affect. Like logically as human beings, once you're aware, when you've tried something and it didn't work and you're aware there's a gap, you want to close that gap. Right? So this shows up in affect, in positive ways and also in negative. And both are powerful for learning. So in the positive ways, it piques your interest in finding the solution. Right? Okay, so what is this correct solution that I did not get to? What is this expert way of thinking? What is this expert knowledge that I need to know to bridge the gap? Okay, so that's interest. The engagement when the expert comes in and shares is very different, right? They're really engaged, wanting to learn. Their attention is very different because of the prior activation and awareness. Their motivation, understand the why is very different. So you really, based on the interaction that happens in these instruction settings, the learners really need to know, oh, why is your method better than mine? Why does that feature of why did that thing that you try better than what I tried? And that's the reason, those are the contrasts that lead to deeper understanding. So that's one of the reasons why we find effects on conceptual understanding, the depth of understanding is greater because learners are going for it. So that's on the positive side, but there are also negative emotions involved. For example, if you try something, it doesn't work, try something else, it still doesn't work. Maybe it's a bit better, but still doesn't work. Over time, this can get frustrating. It's very normal to be frustrated. It's very normal to have some negative emotions. I'm not getting it. This is, so, and we found that, not all positive emotions are positively correlated with learning, and not all negative emotions are negatively correlated with learning. We found in our studies that, sometimes the negative affect, like a bit of frustration, a bit of stress, a bit of negative emotions, like guilt or shame that I can't do it. As long as it's in the safe space within which you're, and with the right mindset that you're cultivating, as long as it's in that safe space, these negative affects actually charge you up very nicely. And they prime you very nicely so that your knowledge has been activated, you're aware that there's a gap, and then your affective state, both positive and negative, is perfectly primed and charged. And if at this state, an expert or a teacher comes together and assembles the knowledge for you, shows you what the correct knowledge or correct ideas are, compares and contrasts between you and what the correct knowledge is, and puts it all together, that's when you say, oh, I get it now. And that's what leads to deep learning. So those are the 4 A's.
Let's get into a little bit into some of them and the brilliant studies that you share. I loved the 1978 study of Karen Booth and the box versus variable throw, which makes total sense in retrospect. But when you think about so many amateur coaches or leaders in organizations, that many of us have got to the positions we're in through box practice in the education system versus a variable practice. And I suppose this is really what the essence of productive failure is.
Yeah. So, those studies were in motor learning, but this idea of variability in initial learning is quite key because variability forces you to adapt, and adaptation leads to learning, because you're constantly changing and adapting to what you learn. So, as you mentioned of coaches, right? If you're a basketball coach or something like that, and you want to teach your students or your players free throws from the standard kind of distance right in front of the board, then a coach an amateur coach might say, okay, well, that's the testing condition. You practice from there, and you practice until you start getting it right. So everybody practices from that one free spot, and they get the free throws. Another, a more professional or more experienced coach might say, yeah, that's ultimately the goal. But, I want you to get to that goal. I want you to practice around the day, and so you get practice from different. And, the idea behind variable practice is counterintuitive, because if you learn by varying the angle, the distance, the effort, and everything, versus where you just practice for one spot where everything is the same, you're learning different things. In one case, it's practice makes perfect. You're honing on one set of parameters, you're trying to hone in on one angle, one strength, one delivery, one perspective. Everything is alive, and you just need to learn that thing. So you will get to high fluency very quickly if you do this. Whereas if you're constantly changing the angle, the perception, the strengths, everything by going around, you are actually adapting all the time. That means you're learning how to coordinate different angles with different perspectives, or, with different strengths, with different deliveries, and so on and so forth. You are trying to coordinate a much more complex system, which will take time to optimize. And then if after that you start practicing from the free spot, yes, there's an initial dip because you've not practiced as much for the free spot. But the idea is that your selection mechanisms, your optimizing mechanisms that you've learned through all those adaptations are so good that very quickly that you get this in a way that's much better than the ones that only practice from the one. And this applies to problem solving. It applies to motor learning. In fact, this came out in a very seminal and very important article back in the day by Schmidt and Bjork called Desirable Difficulties. Because when you vary things, when you make things difficult. Adaptation is difficult, right? So you make things desirably difficult for the learner who's trying to learn that new skill and new knowledge. And in that variation, that difficulty is what leads you to overcompensate, to really train your optimization. And that leads to better learning and more adaptability. So in a game situation, for example, the person who's learned through this desirable difficulty, this deliberate variation, they can optimize from any angle, or they're more likely to be able to do that from any angle, from any part of the game, from under any kind of stress situation, than somebody who's just learned it from one spot all the time.
When I hear that, I always think about the power of rewards. So if I'm a teacher, if I'm a university teacher, and I'm getting rewarded or recognized or just even hitting my targets of I need to have X amount of students achieving X amount of grades, that my desire to try this new way of learning or to have variable learning, which is inevitably better for the person in the world that we're in because it's a variable world. But so much of the education, even at a higher level, even at executive level, is based on a steady state business environment that's like practicing on the free throw spot all the time. And to bring it to your origins of soccer, where a coach can be getting amazing results for the first team at the very, very top, but totally neglecting the academy or forthcoming player, kind of like what they did to Manchester United for Manchester United fans. You milk the cash cow at the top of the organization, but you don't plant any seeds for the future. And for me, that's one of the big things I gleaned from this, is that we should be preparing our children and the future leaders of the world we should be encoding them with variability, but we don't. And therefore, we're not doing any favors for the future of the world.
Exactly. Because ultimately it's variability, even though it's initially difficult to handle. And as long as, again, I keep emphasizing, it's not just variability alone that's key. You got to set the right expectations and mindsets and say, hey, look, I'm going to now make it difficult for you slightly. You will find it challenging, than an easier path. But please understand that provided you put in the right effort and you keep going, and I will keep motivating you. Don't worry about getting to the success very quickly. The important thing is optimizing the complex system. That's where you learn. I think setting those mindsets and providing that safe space for people to have the runway to grow, to develop those capabilities, and then designing the desirable difficulties of variability. That's both need to be done. And good coaches and good teachers do that almost intuitively.
And good business people. And the thing is, when you look at the system's so broken, say it's a VC or that stakeholders or shareholders are putting pressure on results very, very quickly. And they ultimately don't care about the future of the company beyond their investment, maybe 3 or 5 years. So they want that money out. So it's a systemic issue that even great research like this doesn't solve the problem until the system changes as well. Anyway, we could do a whole...
No, I hope you understand. Yeah, it's a perfect example where short-term gains override long-term growth and adaptability. Yeah, that happens in many fields. Yes, absolutely.
A couple of the things I wanted to share were, again, things that people might not think of. So here you talk about fail generation, pre-tested versus pre-questioned, and really, really important, I thought, was pre-testing versus mind-wandering. I'd love you to share some of these concepts.
So pre-testing is basically the idea that, if you're about to learn something new, it seems counterintuitive that I will take a test on that thing that I'm about to learn. I don't know anything about, which is why I'm about to learn that. But I take a test on the same thing. It's the same. And some people say, why would you do that? Why don't you study first, learn it first, and then you take the test? But experiments show that if you take the test, even if you don't understand anything, you answer everything wrong, that test prepares you to attend to the instruction or to the learning event in ways that a person going straight into that learning or instruction event would not have. So, and that's the advantage of pre-testing or of fail generation is you generate, even if you get it wrong initially, that's okay. Because having got it wrong, when you see the correct thing, the getting it wrong actually helps you see the correct thing because, there's something, you encode something that, I remember a question like that. Now they're talking about the same thing. Maybe this is relevant, so I should pay attention to it. So in that sense, you get to the correct answers and you understand them better, having first failed. And that's how pre-testing works.
One of the things that I have a huge dilemma with is I write a weekly article. I've included you in the last 2 because of your input. You've given me all these new studies, etc., that I love. But one of the things that I've used AI for is to clean up my writing. And for me, that's a struggle at the end. So I've written it, I know the concepts. I'd never use AI to come up with ideas for me. I have way too many of them anyway. But I would use it to actually go, make this more accessible or make it easier to read. And I don't always like the output, but it is a huge time saving. And there's a huge attraction to that time saving. But when I read what you wrote about Van Leyen and struggling through an impasse and the importance of that even that struggle is where the knowledge can not only stick better, but you can understand the book better and you can transfer it better to other areas. And I think that's one of the great gifts I get from the show is it's not just knowledge, but it's usable knowledge that I can use in a workshop or in a keynote speech or emceeing an event, but also as a metaphor for something else. And I'd love you to share this idea maybe as our final message of struggling through an impasse and the importance of that struggle.
Yeah. So again, Van Leyen and colleagues showed that, if you are trying to solve a problem and everything is going swimmingly, if you give the explanation at the point in time where you're not stuck or it's at an impasse, you're not going to learn anything from the explanation. It's only when you are stuck or at an impasse, and at that time, if an explanation comes, then it's more likely to need learning than at other times. And that's the idea behind this getting to an impasse. So as in, if you're going about doing your own business, about writing, about speaking, the attraction to make the process very efficient through the use of tools is so obvious, right? Like, why can't I just do that? Or why shouldn't I just do that? And that goes back to me to the question of, are you using this as a learning event or a performance event, right? So if you're using it as a learning event, then I think it's a terrible idea to go straight to the tool. And then I would say, well, you may still go to the tool, but maybe you want to clean up your writing. Maybe you try a little bit first. And then if you're not making headway, then you ask AI, can you now come in? So you got stuck a little bit, you got stuck in a little bit, and then you get, and that would lead to learning. That would be a learning event. But if you're already a very good writer and you know you could definitely do this if you put in a couple of hours, and at your level you are, then the question becomes one of performance. You're optimizing productivity. You already have the skills and you have the expertise. Can I just convert 2 hours into 20 minutes? Can I do that? Then it's a performance event and you go straight for it. And that's what I advise schools in any learning environment. Be very clear. Are you designing a learning event or a performance event? If you confuse the two, so if you really need to learn, that means you don't have the expertise, and you designed it as a performance event, you're not going to learn anything. So a novice using a tool like AI to write, just because AI can give you lots of very good writing or easy to write essays, it can do that for you and make very good arguments even. Well, yes, you can perform well, but you're not going to learn how to write. You will never, because the writing is being done by that. So that's where people conflate learning with performance. Whereas for novices, if it's important to learn, well, then they need to put in the effort.
Brilliant.
For experts, if it's important to perform, then that's okay. You can optimize your productivity using tools.
You've made me feel better, man. So last question, we'll leave this audience. I know you have to head off. Manu's kindly fit us in here despite his busy schedule. Let's leave our audience with one cognitive reflection test, and anybody who emails this into me will be the winner. But try not to cheat because you have to go through the struggle.
Okay. All right. So here it goes. You've got to answer this question as quickly as possible. The first thing that comes to your mind. If 5 people paint 5 walls in 5 days, how many days would it take 10 people to paint 10 walls?
That's over to you, and we'll answer that next day. For those who got this far in the episode, I have a final little quote here from Manu that I just love to finish today's show. Productive failure's true power is unleashed when we internalize it as a way of thinking, knowing, and being in this world, helping us seek, design, and harness the other side of failure on a regular basis until it becomes part of us in everything we do, and perhaps it ultimately becomes us. Beautiful. Author of Productive Failure, Manu Kapur. Thank you for joining us for part 2.
Thank you, Aidan. Looking forward to more.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who make all of this possible. Beautiful sign here behind me on the shelf. Kyndryl runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses with a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability. Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at kyndryl.com, and also the Kyndryl Institute has many of our former guests from the show, future guests from the show as well, who've written articles and content on their Institute page, www.kyndryl.com/institute. See you soon.